right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you to all of you who've joined the webinar today. I'm sure we'll have a few more join along the way. Um, Let me just start by talking a little bit about why we decided to do a skills-based organizations webinar. There's rarely a call today that we're on that doesn't involve some form of discussion about skills. And so between St. Charles Consulting Group and NIIT, which have joined forces recently around this topic of skills and skills-based organizations. We've done a lot of surveys, research. I'll talk a little bit more about who we've talked to. But before we do that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panel. My name is Larry Durham. I lead St. Charles Consulting Group. I've been with the firm for 10 years now, and we're very excited about what's going on in the space of talent and skills and how we help our clients focus on that. I also have with me, I'll jump ahead here and talk about Craig Friedman. Craig is one of our senior talent strategists. Craig, myself, and others have been working on a number of key client projects and initiatives around skills and what that means. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about today focuses on that. And then lastly, we have Jonathan 18. Jonathan's based in London and head of consulting for NIIT. Obviously, we work extremely closely together, and want to talk a little bit about skills. And I think Jonathan brings a very interesting perspective as we expand globally and as we serve our clients globally, what that looks like. So Jonathan, you want to take just a moment before I go into the objectives to talk about what we're doing in the space of skills and what we're offering there?
Yeah, sure. By all means, Larry, I might just take a moment to just explain a little bit about, you mentioned the combination of St. Charles and NIIT, and those two organizations coming together, both of which are very strong in consulting, is separate and distinct from the rest of the NIIT businesses. And if you put the two organizations together, we've got access to around about 400 consultants globally, serving clients in North America, right across Europe, the Middle East, and across Asia into Australia. So it's a global presence in terms of where we are offering. We work with clients in a variety of different sectors, from heavy industry, mining, manufacturing, automotive, airlines, through financial services, professional services, pharma, FMCG. We've got a breadth of clients that is pretty much second to none. And our consulting offer is only around kind of learning, talent, and more recently around the skills-based organizations. So we help those organizations in those particular areas really think through the evolution of their learning and talent strategies end to end to help them transform. We help a number of them with regards to their approaches to becoming or using skills-based types of philosophies, strategies, and becoming a skills-based organization. We work with a number of them around senior team and individual and team development. And we work with a number of organizations as well around the challenges, which we'll talk about this morning, this evening, this afternoon, wherever you are in the world, about the kind of challenges around technology and how that can be both an enabler, but also a challenge as well too. And also the fact that you can get a lot of data and insight out of those systems. So we've got a very broad capability and also a very broad global reach and a broad client base. So hopefully we'll have some stories to tell through the course of this webinar and beyond that will help you think a little bit about this particular topic.
Yeah, nicely said, Jonathan. And the thing that excites me as we were thinking about this webinar and the insights that we've been able to glean, there's much more to do, but on what we've gleaned so far is predicated on multinational and global organizations we've worked with, as well as strategic assessments working across organizations. Craig and I have just recently finished. Actually, we're still in the midst of it. It's about to finish a strategic project around skills on a global basis on what a strategy should look like. So we're excited to share some of our insights on that. All right, Shivani, if you go to the next slide, let me talk real quickly. We want to do three things today. Introduce the drivers of skills. I've been, like most of us on this call, in consulting for a long, long time. And I always say it's probably just as important, if not more so, to frame the problem and the challenge and know what you're trying to achieve as it is to give a solution. And so some of what we're going to talk about on this webinar is how we frame the problem, or how our clients have started to frame the problem and maybe some ahas that we've seen from that and what that looks like, as well as some of the models we've created for maturity and readiness. So hopefully that will be insightful. I think it will be. We'll talk about the panel's insight. What we're going to do is for the first 30 minutes, we'll focus on that first objective. We'll go through some slides and models. In the second half, we've allowed 30 minutes of this hour of time to really discuss the panel's experience amongst the three of us, our insights, and really topically look at skills across L&D, across resource management and credentialing, just a number of areas that I think would be useful for many people in the talent and the skills space. So we'll talk about that. And then finally, we'll leave about 10 minutes for Q&A, as well as give you an opportunity to be involved, to benchmark yourself. We have a nice offering there if you want to benchmark yourself and compare to other organizations. Last thing I'll say there is, amongst the three of us, we're going to be busy talking on this topic. If you have any questions, feel free to use the chat. Tom Kupetis, who's also part of the firm, a key part of the firm, will be fielding some of those, and then we'll bring those forward to the Q&A, depending on the complexity and the relevance to everyone involved. So those, we've got a lot of objectives packed in here, but that's what we want to achieve here in the next 55 minutes or so. So don't feel inhibited. Feel free to ask any questions you might have in the chat. And it's really about bringing value to you guys in terms of what we've heard. All right. Good deal. Well, let's move forward. Let's get into the meat of what we want to talk about. As part of, for the last, I would say, year and a half to 2 years, thinking about where skills are going and what's driving that. In a moment, we'll talk about that. But one thing it compelled us to do collectively was to think about where organizations are struggling, what's the impetus for skills, and what are they trying to do. And I think so often it comes down to something quite simple. Skills are changing quickly. Everything needs to be skills oriented. There's not a strategy around it. What we did was we started to focus on a methodology and a tool. Of course, what we're looking at here is a maturity model where we help organizations. We've done this a number of times now in terms of where they're at on this journey and ultimately where they want to be. Not everyone wants to be on the far right-hand side, but we've created a maturity model. And we've also created something called STREAM. If you look down, obviously, the left-hand side, the strategy, the transformation effort, the recognition, which Craig will talk about in a moment, enablement, alignment, and management systems or technology. So we've kind of simplified it into what we call STREAM. And what we have done on this front is we created a survey that went out to 20 global and multinational organizations. Most of them were well over 100,000 individuals, and we had them rate themselves. So when I talked about benchmarking earlier, we have a fairly good data set, as well as others that we worked with in addition to that survey, followed up with interviews, further informed the thinking to understand where organizations are today, both on the strategic and the execution element. We know there's a lot of discussion around it. What are people really doing about it? What is that focus on? And so just wanted to introduce this and take note of this. In just a moment, I'm going to ask you to think about where your organization is. We're not going to do that quite yet, but just give some thought to defining, emerging, developing, transforming, and adapting. And we realize in the limited amount of time here, you're not going to be able to think about all the dimensions. It's relatively new, but just give a little bit of thought as to where your organization fits. So Shivani, if you'll go to the next slide, I'm going to have Craig talk in more detail about the components of this and how we think about a skills-based organization.
Yeah, and so the formal assessment vehicle that we have for interviewing folks and assessing the maturity is actually broken down into 23 different attributes across these different elements of what we're calling STREAM. And just broadly speaking, we've broken them down into these 6 elements because strategically we think they get at an important different dimensions of a skills-based talent strategy. So from a strategy perspective, when we're talking about the different elements of strategy, we're looking at things like its priority in the organization, how much investment or commitment the organization is putting into skills-based talent strategy, how the culture is aligned, the organizational culture is aligned with skills, what kind of governance is in place across the organization to help guide a skill-based talent strategy, those kinds of elements. Transformation deals with the transformation of work, and that deals with things like changing service delivery models, and how that is driving a realignment of talent around skills. It also deals with issues like the redesign of work due to emerging technologies like AI. Recognition deals with those processes and mechanisms that recognize and define skills. So we're talking about whatever the processes are for coming up with a common language for skills, defining them, creating a structure, taxonomy, ontology, etc., how those are managed, how skills are, new skills are sensed, retired, recognized, inferred, etc. That's all part of skills recognition. Enablement, skills enablement, deals with learning, upskilling, reskilling, leadership development, the strategic process of identifying and enabling the workforce with the skills that are desired. Alignment deals with aligning those skills across the talent spectrum. So that deals with aligning things like recruiting, resource management, compensation and benefits, org design, etc. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then the management systems deal with all the various technologies that enable skills-based talent management. And there is quite an ecosystem of technologies these days that are constantly evolving, that are enabling some of these skills-based talent. And so this vehicle that we developed has a total of 23 different attributes that we measure across these 6 categories of stream.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but like I mentioned before, even further defining this between strategic and execution elements. But I think Greg did a nice job of kind of defining these 6 and thinking about, what does that look like across the levels that you might have. Let's move forward, and we'll get into. We gave you a quick moment there to ponder a very, very complex topic, but for just a moment, what I'd like you guys to do, as you think about skills in your role, where does your organization fit between defining on the nascent end, not really defined or even utilizing skills effectively yet, all the way through adapting in a thriving, meaningful way. I'm going to stop for just a moment, have Shivani put up a poll right now, and I'll give you maybe 20 seconds. It's just a single click, give you a little bit of time to answer that question.
And I think, Larry, everyone's responded.
Okay, great.
A few more seconds.
Quick off the mark today.
I never know how much time to give, so I appreciate how efficient everyone is. Are we able to see, Shivani, can you share what that looks like? Are we able to see those results?
Yes.
Right.
I'll read them out first, and then I'll see if they can be displayed. So 42% are at emerging, followed by 25% at developing, 17% at defining, and then 8% each are on transforming and adapting.
Awesome. Well, I'm not right very often, but our historical data is, as we look at this and you turn it on its side, that's exactly what we have found in terms of a bell curve, right? And most of the peak of the bell curve tends to come at emerging, maybe trending a little bit towards developing. We have seen some differences in our surveys and interviews globally. We've looked at professional services firms. We've looked at knowledge workers. We've looked at, more manufacturing. We've looked across the gamut. We have seen some differences. In fact, we're further exploring if knowledge workers and organizations that have fungible delivery models are moving to skills more quickly. So there's some more research to be done there. But what we have here, what you guys have responded, seems to be a fairly good cross section, and it's very consistent with what we've seen. Is people are in the early days. There's a few things that are happening, and with that, what I'd like to do is have Jonathan talk a little bit, and I may weigh in as well on the next slide. What we're finding, which is what is driving skills? What are the business drivers? Skills are always in service of the business, of course, and so an important part of this is what's driving that. So Jonathan, I'll have you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure, Larry. Thanks very much. And one thing, I mean, Craig did a great job in terms of defining and outlining the stream model and the complexity of the 23 different parameters. What he forgot to mention was the fact that the fun we had coming up with the acronym STREAM and fitting that into to work with it as well too. So there was a fun side to the complexity that went with it. But
Sure.
Let's take a look at this. I think this is really important to get your head around in terms of how ready you are to go down or start utilizing skills in your organization. There's a lot of hype in the market about skills-based org. We and others of other consulting firms are putting stuff out there. That lots of the vendors are talking about skills to enable them to sell whatever product services that they have. AI is commonly used. There's a lot of noise around this topic, but I think it's really important to kind of step back and to frame what are the business drivers as to whether you are ready. I have spoken to countless firms around this topic, and I remember very, very specifically one CHRO of a well-known firm, which I won't mention the name of, who, when their team was going to go down that route in terms of looking at skills, was like, hold on, we are not ready. We do not have a strategy. We do not have a philosophy. We don't have a shared understanding. We will confuse the organization more than we will do if we go down this route. But let's take a look at these 4 quadrants. As you can see, a 2x2, and we love a kind of a 2x2 in our world. But to unpack it, the 2 dichotomies, right? You've got the kind of the differences here between the operational, the day-to-day running across the left, from left to right, at the bottom row, and the kind of the areas that are, the output of the talent, the workforce that you've got. And there's a distinction in terms of where you're actually working and what you're doing in your organization, how it works. And across the top, as you can see, very much focused on today, the here, the now, the this quarter, and then looking at tomorrow, the future. Where are we moving in that particular area? And this kind of gives rise to the 4 quadrants in terms of the business drivers. Most of the organizations, are very much focused primarily in the current operational, the bottom left. Why is that? Well, it's kind of very much around making sure that we're in today. We're producing, we're getting products out the door, we're getting the services out to our clients and customers. We're making money in that particular space. It's therefore concrete with regards to the drivers that you can see, and therefore most activity is focused around that particular space. As you kind of move around, the kind of next areas kind of get a little bit more conceptual. Then you can see that you can go into the talent current area where there might be a driver that we've got some skill shortages. We might need to do some upskilling because you haven't got enough capacity or capability to deliver things in the current market. We have a real problem there. And therefore, that kind of area in the talent current, you can see being a real driver for skills to be used in that particular area. Conversely, in the bottom right, in the operational future, the future ways of working are kind of really begin to think about what are the new areas, what are the decomposition of roles, what are the global market changes, how are things moving there? Do we need to reskill people in that particular space? So I think those kind of 3 boxes are kind of really where the majority of work and organizations are focused. The kind of the conceptual one on the top right, the future talent, is very much that. It's very kind of conceptual in terms of the way that it feels. And I think, therefore, there's a lot of talk and a lot of hype, but not a lot of doing in some of these areas. So less time spent in that particular box in terms of the kind of the drivers there in that particular space, but more so in the bottom left in that area. But this is a neat framework to enable you to understand what are the things challenging you to use skills. Could skills be a solution or one of the many solutions for your challenges in the workplace to help you adapt to provide value, which is obviously what businesses and organizations are all about. Now, you said you had some comments as well. I know you like this.
Yeah, I think some of the insights we had, I think you articulated it really well. Some of the ahas we had when we went through this, as Jonathan said, most of this came through interviews. Oftentimes when we were interviewing, we were talking to 30 or 40 individuals across an organization globally to really understand this and quantifying where their focus was. Jonathan nailed it. The current operational need, as you would expect, how do we make money? How do we drive the business? How do we not become obsolete and have the skills we need? On average was somewhere in the 55 to 60% range. Now that varies, but that was probably the most common range, 55 to 60. What we also heard, though, albeit conceptual, when you get into the future talent aspect of it, there was individuals who have a talent role. Many of you on this call, on this webinar, may have a talent, skills, L&D, HR role. There's a lot of talk and a lot of focus and a lot of, to Jonathan's point, a lot of strategic thinking around future talent. And what's really interesting was when we pulled back the covers and we've started doing engagements around these topics, where there often becomes a rub, even though they don't necessarily aren't different, is current operational and future talent needs. They almost feel incongruent, right? Younger talent want to be more mobile, changing labor market, non-traditional pools. It almost makes the current operational need around skills more complicated. And so some of the strategies that we're seeing and the rubs that we're finding within organizations often come between those two dimensions of current operational and future talent. But to Jonathan's point, it's a great way to think about what is it you're trying to do with skills. It's not the answer to all of that, but again, I think framing the problem, articulating it in a way. We had one of our clients look at this and say, this makes a lot of sense. We've been struggling to articulate where we're disparate in our strategies. And so this is albeit simple, a beginning way or a starting point to think about what that looks like. With that being said, just in the interest of time, we're going to look at one more slide before we get into our panel conversation. And what I'd like to do is ask Craig, this correlates to what we just looked at in terms of operational and talent and service delivery and future of work. This starts to look at these elements and how they maybe are at opposite ends. And I'll let Craig talk a little bit about this slide.
Yeah. So what we've got here is we put together this graphic. What we've got here is the talent value chain, right? The elements of talent, and we laid it out in this way because it's helping us to describe the skills-based talent journeys that we were hearing about, right? Essentially, what you've got here is we've got different folks who are entering the skills-based talent journey at different places on this, which we might think of as a ladder or a set of steps, right? So, for example, we hear a lot of folks who are entering the journey sort of over here on the left. Current operational drivers are causing them to need to do a lot of rapid upskilling or reskilling. That could be because their technology is rapidly changing and they need to rapidly upskill in order to get product out the door, or they're changing their service delivery models. They're having cost pressures and they're moving work, they're offshoring a certain amount of work. And that means that they have to upskill onshore resources and a variety of things to that nature. And it's all driving a lot of upskilling and reskilling that's focusing them on skills-based talent. And then what happens is if the driver is focusing them to enter on the left side of this picture, typically what happens is that they start to address the most adjacent areas next, because as soon as you start upskilling people, you start thinking of how do we get them quickly deployed to the places where they're needed most appropriately. And if we can get them deployed to the people where they're needed most appropriately, how do I know that they have the right skills that they need? And so people tend to progress through their skills-based talent journey to these adjacent boxes. However, it's also possible to start this journey, from a different direction. It depends on your business drivers. So if you're coming from the upper right part of the 2x2, the future talent needs, if you're looking at this from, let's say, a talent acquisition place, you have a scarcity of talent. You can't get enough of the right sort of people. It's causing a major issue. You have to start to think much more dramatically about how you're sourcing resources in your organization, or maybe if career management is a major driver of keeping the people that you have. So if you're entering on the right side of this organization, again, people tend to, depending on what the drivers are, proceed to the areas that are next to it. Because if you're starting with recruiting, you're very quickly going to start thinking about how are we compensating people for the skills that we're looking for, and how are they going to proceed through the organization. So one of the other things that we've noticed is this is for large organizations, this does not necessarily mean that you have to start all the way at the right or all the way at the left, or that the entire organization is on a unitary journey. You could have different parts of the organization starting a journey in different places. And so it could be that you have one business unit that has sort of started their skills-based talent journey sort of on the left here because they're being driven by immediate operational needs, while some group in talent is looking at skills-based recruiting and on their journey, while yet another group is, because of a business disruption, is looking at a talent marketplace, and they're sort of starting in the middle here. And so they have three separate journeys going on simultaneously, and that's okay. But at some point, as everybody starts, progressing down this ladder, they're all going to meet. And so the critical point is when they meet, that they have developed a common language or a common framework, so that when they all meet together, they have common reporting and common systems that can talk to one another, so that they can interoperate, and so they can have an enterprise-wide skill-based strategy. Because if they don't have that common governance and common strategy, then they're going to have different. It won't have a common language, and they won't. They'll have multiple systems that can't talk to one another, and they can't operate at an enterprise level.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important. And I think you started to hit on something, Craig, that as we go into this panel discussion, we'll drill down on this because it's complex. There's a lot of moving parts to it. But as you think about it, your view of what the importance of skills are and what is needed to happen within the organization largely is dependent upon the role that you play. Whether you're in the L&D group, whether you're in resource management, whether you're in, career management and organization design, everyone has a slightly different view. And what I'd like to do, maybe we'll just take the slides down and we'll just go into, or if you'd like, Shivani, you can leave this slide up if it's easier. We may reference this because we're actually going to talk about three of these areas and just have a conversation about them. And what I'd like to do is have some real life practical examples of what we're seeing with organizations. And so I think that's what I'll do is we'll just go into our panel discussion from here. And let's start with, oftentimes we work a lot with the learning and development groups within organizations. Of course, we work across the talent value chain. But one thing that we work across is L&D. And L&D, when you think about skills, the question is, well, what are the skills and how are they organized and how do we tag them? And so we often hear about using skills taxonomies and ontologies to drive upskilling and reskilling efforts. Think about this for a moment. I think everyone's aware of this, but as the skills change, of course, the upskilling and reskilling is going to have to happen more quickly. L&D and other groups need to be more prepared, look ahead. What skill sensing do we need? What skills do we have? What do we need to develop? But I guess my first question would be, and I'll start with you, Jonathan. When we talk about skills taxonomies and ontologies to drive upskilling and reskilling efforts, what are you seeing as clients' biggest challenges in implementing a skills framework?
Just hit me with an easy one straight out of the gate. Yeah,
there are no easy
Thanks so much. Right. So I think, I think it's important that, if you're in that particular role and looking at it either from the business perspective or from a talent perspective, that, the main thing is you do need a point of view on what you have in the organization to enable a number of the kind of things we're looking at. If you're looking at a reskilling effort, you need to understand what you've got and so on and so forth. But let's just kind of demystify. I used a couple of terms there, taxonomy and ontology. And they often get used interchangeably. Now, taxonomies have been around forever and a day, right? Competency matrices of different descriptions have been present in lots of different organizations. They're merely a way of classifying different skills in some ways. Ontology is more of a newer term that kind of gets used. It's more about the relationship between the various different things. And I do think it's worthwhile trying to understand the nuances of what those two processes actually mean. So, my advice to organizations that are considering, implementing taxonomies is you can go long, deep, really very, very cumbersome, and it can take an extremely long time to devise those kind of things. And the challenge that many organizations have is it becomes a tick in a box exercise where I've got a 6,000, 4,000, 2,000 skills I've got to classify myself at, which, it's just impossible for any individual or team or organization to do. And by the time that they've built something, the pace of change in today's marketplaces, it'll be out of date by the time it's finished. So, I kind of think that those kind of things are probably difficult to use. They may serve a purpose, but they're not practical in many cases. Think then about ontologies, and the other challenge with these is that everybody has an ontology, right? All the number of vendors have got ontologies. There's an ontology for skills in my HCM platform. There's an ontology for skills in my LXP. There's an ontology in my skills inference system. My talent marketplace has got one in. It's like, well, what is correct? How do we do that? And I think you just need to take some cold, hard decisions with regards to what would be the correct way of doing things. And the launch of these kind of things across the organization does give rise to as well, Larry, that, you've got the significant reliance on individual self-rating and the individuals doing it. So you've got no idea whether you've got consistency of quality or consistency of assessment in those particular spaces across the organization. That's another major challenge that we see organizations facing into as well too. And I think finally, and I'm sure Craig's got some views on this one as well, but there's a lot of nuance around various different things. We see a lot of people getting very, very, very specific about certain skill sets. We talk about in our kind of area in consulting, you take a big consulting firm that, we on this panel have all worked for, right? If you're in consulting, you need to develop executive presence. That's what we want. If you're an audit, you need to have, you need to be able to do the audit presentation. You also need to facilitate, you need to present, you need to communicate. And if you think about it, they're all very, very similar. They're just applied in a very different context. So we need a clearer classification at a higher level of presentation, communication, influence, and facilitation, or one of those things classifying that. So I think we can get too tied up and too detailed around these kind of things as well too.
Yeah.
So
you hit on something there. You hit on something that I think is incredibly important, which is, and we've come across it. Sometimes organizations knew it straight away. Others came onto it, which was skills and skills classification and taxonomies without context, right? If you say presentation skills in a professional services firm versus presentation skills in another area, or project management on IT versus project management on nuclear power plant, right? There has to be context. Otherwise, genericized skills probably will not be sufficient.
Yeah, I mean, let's just take an example close to home, and that just to really, if you take a business partner, right? You've got IT business partners, HR business partners, learning business partners, finance business partners, right? Now, all of those need to negotiate. The fundamental skill in negotiation is the same thing, but the way they apply it, I mean, IT would be around project dates and delivery and cut over dates, and HRBPs may be doing things in a different way, and finance BPs would be negotiating on a different context and topic. Right. So I think, there's definitely something that is needed to be worked through there.
Hey, Craig, on that front, what about, Jonathan kind of alluded to this, but how important is it that it's consistent? So when you think about various functions, you think about various entities, member firms working. And so if there is any future mobility, when you think about that upper right-hand quadrant, how important is it, or what are some of the enterprise consistency issues that you've come across in some of the projects we've been working on?
Well, I think one of the challenges is that when one of the things that we hear is that when different groups of people are trying to get to a common language or consistent definitions, is the nature of the context, if you will, that they have an interest in can be different, right? So to Jonathan's point, if you're looking from a resource management perspective for a project manager, you probably do care a lot about the nature of how those project management skills were employed. Are they a marketing project manager or an IT project manager? And if it's IT, what are the platforms that they did? And was it a global implementation? And did they use agile processes or waterfall processes, or a whole bunch of interesting context around how that was employed? Now, if you're an L&D professional and someone says, I need you to develop or find or source some sort of program to develop project management skills, you have a whole bunch of different questions, right? Because to you, project management is a whole field, and I need to know, well, does that include budgeting? Does that include work breakdown structures? Does that include status reporting? Does it include stakeholder management? There's a whole bunch, there's an entirely different dimension of context that I need to understand. So I need to know, like, how many chapters are in my program, or how many different modules do I need to go out and source to fill that? And so that's one of the complexities that organizations are finding, is depending on the group. But we've outlined at this point almost a dozen different dimensions of sort of context or complexity that different groups mean when they want to know more about quote unquote project management, right? The two words. Right. And so the groups get together and they start to have those conversations, right? They start to document essentially their use cases around the skills, what they need them for, what they use them for. And so that they can bring themselves to having a common definition or a common framework.
Yeah. Let me move ahead. There's, on the next section I want to talk about is resource management and maybe some about credentialing, but a lot of what's driving skills, as we know, is fast moving technology, introduction of, I'm going to say introduction of AI. It's been around for a long time, but to the masses, the introduction of AI. People are starting to imagine, with the automation, with the acceleration, with the shortened shelf life of skills, it's all about skills, right? And I think one thing that was interesting on that latter chart that we were showing Craig is that at the center, it's about adaptable talent. So in the 2x2, talent wants to be more fungible and adaptable and more experiences and develop themselves. The business wants more adaptable talent that can adapt and be ready for whatever new skills are coming down the pipe. All these kind of things. So as I think about resource management, so let's step away from maybe taxonomies. If I think about resource management, part of this is being driven, as usual, by a lot of technology and new capabilities. And so people are thinking about the value of implementing talent marketplaces. What skills do I have? How do I match them with roles? And so, Jonathan, maybe I'll ask you, what should organizations be considering before implementing or thinking about a talent marketplace? What would be some of those considerations?
Well, it seems to be the topic of the day, right? Everybody was buying NLXP about 4 or 5 years ago, and everybody now seems to be buying a talent marketplace, and for good reason, right? The value of these is potentially huge, right? And but there are some constraints. So to answer your question very, very specifically, I think, if you're, depending on where and how you're going to do it, and that's an important question. Are you doing a pilot? Are you doing it at function? Are you doing enterprise wide? What is your deployment process? Obviously, with any technology launch needs to be thought through. But I think it's really important that you have a really clear use case or set of use cases for why you're going to be implementing this. Because, you can give more engagement, you give more visibility to internal roles through it. You can empower employees to look at new jobs, gigs, projects, assignments, etc. You can increase the level of diversity in terms of the use of it with less bias, because we now have greater visibility of other people that we would never be considering. We always chose Johnny because we know Johnny and we like Johnny and we think Johnny's good, right? You can get access to hidden skills that you didn't know there because you've got the data it's showing you. You can unlock extra capacity. You can increase the resilience of the organization in terms of the way it's worked because it's got more ability to be mobile. So, I mean, there's a plethora of others as well, but there's some common ones in terms of that kind of use cases. So I think it's important to kind of set it up and to try and help be very clear about why you're doing it. Because fundamentally what you're talking about, as you mentioned, supply and demand. On the one side, you've got employees with everything they're bringing, right? With the skills, their interests, I suppose their aspirations, their motivations, that's the supply. On the other side, you've got the organizational construct, which is what's the gig, what's the role, what's the project, what's the assignment, and that's the demand. And then you have the system matching the two in the middle through the AI in that way, which can enhance career moves and so on and so forth. So that's the system, that's what it offers, and therefore that's what it can bring. But it kind of, it works in some industries better than others. And let me just unpack what I mean by that. Because fundamentally, if you think about it, you are doing away with the job structure and the hierarchy and the organizational design, because it works on a defined project, role, assignment, period of time basis, rather than a formal moving of a traditional person moving from one function into another and sitting in the organogram because they're at that level. So, consulting lends itself to that, project-based type work industry does, but more traditional structures, there'll be more challenge around, Larry.
What's fascinating, Craig and myself and other colleagues have been talking about this a lot lately. And, you said that a talent marketplace is predicated, its success is predicated on two main things. Well, first of all, the overarching is that your organizational structure and mindset of how you work can be more fluid, as you just talked about. The other one is, the skills of your people. And I can't tell you how many of our clients have said, we don't really have a good handle on what our skills are within our organization. And then the other one is still sensing. We really don't know what lies ahead. And how do we keep our finger on the pulse of what's coming? And so the irony of talent marketplaces, I see the value of them as well, but they're not going to be very successful if organizations don't have a good sense on what skills you have and what skills you need and how those two things come together. And with that, Craig, maybe I'll ask you, badging and credentialing comes up a lot. Talk a little bit about what you've seen. And I think maybe people are relying a little bit more on that because they need some codification of a skill. And that might be an enabler of a talent marketplace. But talk a little bit about your experience with badging on that front.
Yeah, well, we certainly have seen, there's a lot of interest in credentialing systems that we're hearing about. But I think what we're hearing a lot about with our clients is sort of an active discussion of how do we actually know? It's great that I can attach two words to Craig's profile that says project management, but it still doesn't tell me that Craig's any good at that. Right. And so the question becomes, how do we ascertain that those two words, what does that really mean about how good he is at that? Right? Did he complete a training course? Is completing a training course sufficient? If I spent the weekend and took 40 hours of training to complete a bunch of training courses, does that make me enough of an expert that I can get staffed on something important? Do I have to demonstrate performance in some way? Does it have to be sort of tied with some level of experience? Does it actually depend on the skill? Are there some skills like negotiation where nuance between like novice level and mastery is terribly important? And are there other skills where I just care that you can program in this language or you can't program in this language? And it's an on or off thing, right? If you can, like, I could give you a test, and if you can, program this bit of code, good enough for me. And so it turns out there's a lot of nuance in trying to assess whether someone has the skill that you're looking for. And so a lot of the organizations are giving it a lot of thought, a lot of conscientious thought as to what is necessary to figure out. And then also the efficiency of the process, right? Because there also comes a point where, especially when you think about something like resource management recruiting, a lot of organizations get to the place where they're like, look, I don't expect the system to make the final choice at the end of the day. And, they're narrowing the field, right? And I have to talk to people at the end of the day. Either the candidate I need to talk to directly, or I need to talk to people who've worked with them to try to assess. So I just need the system to, get me the 5 most qualified candidates. And then, given that, maybe we can scale back on some of the credentialing so that it's, from a more pragmatic standpoint. It depends. All this stuff depends on the nature of the organization, on the nature of the task, on the skill. Is it mission critical? Is it, is there, people's safety, at hand, depending on the industry that you're in? Like all these things play into the factors. And so it's not a no-brainer to come up with, the credentialing and assessment strategy to determine, right, whether who has what skills.
I think this is really important. If I had to put a fine point on this part of the conversation, we hear it all the time, right? Skills are the currency of today's business. Skills are the currency. Skills are the currency. Okay. So you've got to define what currency it is you're using and what you need. That's on one side. As Craig just talked about it, I think what's really important, and Jonathan mentioned this as well, if skills is the currency, what's the authentication of that currency, right? When I go to the store and they take the marker out and say, is this really a $100 bill?
What are you trying to say? Who's the bank, right?
Right, exactly. So there's two things. There's the authentication, which is it a credential? Is it a badge? What's going to, because all of a sudden, when my placement and my importance in the organization and my skill is valued based on what I say, there's going to be a lot of rigor around that. And then to Jonathan's point, the talent marketplace might be the bank, right? That might be the exchange between the currency that's needed, the authentication. And so you start to see the complexities of this. And I would reinforce what Jonathan said, which is some organizations are more predisposed. If you go to a consulting or an advisory practice in professional services who have worked this way for 20 years, we have a project, we have skills, we bring them together, we go on different projects. I think they're moving more quickly in this area, and it's not as much of a leap. I do think other organizations who've had more traditional structures are thinking a little bit more about what would this look like for their organization. So this isn't a one size fits all by any means. One last question I'll ask, and then I'm going to hold and we'll go to some Q&A. But I'm curious, when we think about going to the other end of the spectrum around career management and organization design, let's just focus on career management. If we go to the talent, the upper right-hand box on the 2x2, future talent, what do younger workers want? They want more exposure. They want more experiences. They want to be more fluid, being exposed to different things in the organization. The technology is actually potentially allowing that to happen within a skills-based organization. It may interfere or conflict with current operational needs, but how does a skills-first talent strategy affect career mobility? Does it, just real quickly, do you guys think it enables that? Is it kind of the dawn of a new era where talent has more control? Or is it going to be more the commoditization of talent where we place people when and where we need it to focus on the lower left? Or is it going to be a move towards the upper right?
I'd like to think, being a kind of a bit philosophical about this, Larry, that it actually empowers the talent, the people. I mean, I hate the term talent management because that suggests an organization manages individual. That's just completely the wrong way around, in my opinion, because the talent will manage themselves. But that's the point I'm trying to make. I think it does empower them, because if you think about mobility in an organization, traditionally the ones with really well-defined, not rigid, but well-defined kind of architectures of job families, where it's easy to say, I think I can move there and provide value, that's where and how mobility will happen. I think this kind of stuff here, where people are actually bringing all of themselves to work, because one of the things we haven't mentioned as well is that this skills thing probably gives the opportunity of saying, well, because if I'm in a role and I'm doing a role, I'm doing that role. But what I might not be showing is I may have skills that could deliver 5 or 6 different things in different functions or in different ways, but I'm just not using them, or I'm being not performance managed in my current role in that respect. So I think it empowers the individuals to do that. I do think it gives, therefore, a lot of opportunity for individuals to kind of really, use work to get the right kind of education, exposure, experience to what they want to do, right? Moving forward. So I'd like to think that I'm in that camp, that it's empowering the talent, and that the talent themselves will be in a better place as a result of the use of skills.
Yeah. One last thing I'll say here, and just in the interest of time, we'll move to Q&A. I think there's a propensity, there has to be a governor of sorts on both ends here, right? I think on the talent side, some of the jobs that I've seen, or some of the books that I've seen, like Work Without Jobs and things like that, is probably maybe a bit too far, right? It's a little futuristic in terms of we're just fluid and we do what we want to do, and it magically comes together. I think there's the risk of that on the talent side.
Right.
I think on the bigger risk is on the current operational side, the over-indexing of skills and commoditization of talent. To use talent as a widget. I need Jonathan for 3 hours. I need Craig for 2 hours. We may run the risk of de-emphasizing talent and in a tight labor market, and just because of the value of people, we may over-index and go too far down that path. And I think that's probably some good counsel to anyone going down this. Don't go too far, because I think a completely skills-oriented environment probably de-emphasizes talent and makes you not a great place to work or even retain talent. That might be a difficult situation. Yeah. All right. In the interest of time, I know we've only got about 8 minutes left. I went a little bit over on those questions, but it was good conversation. So thank you, Craig and Jonathan. Couple questions. I'm looking at the questions now. Here's one from Lee, and it says, where have you seen the shift to being a skills-based organization really pay off and be transformational or impactful as large organizations shift from command and control to a new model? Craig and Jonathan, any response to that? I'm happy to weigh in, but wanted to see if you guys had any response to that.
One of the things we've been talking about amongst ourselves recently is, in some ways, we've been making analogies of skills-based talent into a manufacturing environment when it moves from sort of MRP planning to lean manufacturing. Because essentially what you're doing is you're bringing down, if you're in like a professional services firm or even any service-based organization, essentially what you're selling is skills. Skills is your product, skills is your inventory. And if it's sitting unused, right, that's like inventory in your warehouse not being used. And so what you want to do is get your people efficiently out there working with your customers or your clients. That's where you're earning money, right? And the way we typically tend to do this is we have these massive training events where we train up a bunch of people, a large number of people, months and months in advance or years in advance of when they're going to use their skills. It's not very just in time. It's not very efficient. It's not very effective. As we bring down our method of planning from the level of the job, I'm going to resource you at the job level to a job you're going to sit in for a year or 2 years or 3 years on a long-term assignment, and I bring it down to the skills level. It's like bringing down my production capacity from, mass producing 1,000 units at a time to producing 1 unit at a time, right? And that drives a lot of efficiency because now my production is a lot more efficient, right? I can get things through the system much more quickly. I can upskill in real time. All the benefits of lean manufacturing by having sort of lot sizes of one and pull-based manufacturing and all those benefits, it's a very similar kinds of argument, right? Because now I'm deploying at the individual skill level or the task level. I can upskill in real time for an individual project need, right? It creates a lot more flexibility and adaptability of my talent, so that I can respond in much closer to real time to changes in skill needs in the marketplace. I think that's where at least one of the very strong value propositions is, for sure.
Yeah, I think, Lee, my response, in addition to what Craig just said, is it's a fundamentally different way of thinking about how the business is run, and the change management and the transition is substantial. And so what we're seeing is the opportunity marketplace, something where it's not the core operations, but an opportunity marketplace where people can look for opportunities to develop their skills, to either volunteer or weigh in. So it's getting into the mindset of, I'm interested in doing more or beyond what I'm just doing. Or if I were to go down this path, what skills would I need that I don't currently have? And so it's thinking more from, how do I identify and develop skills that are necessary? I think we're in the early days. Like I said, there's a handful of organizations we've worked with that are already using a talent marketplace. But I would maybe reinforce what you said, Lee, which is primarily organizations that were predisposed to that already. And now new organizations are starting to think about, does that fundamentally change how we work? So
there are, however,
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Larry, I didn't mean to talk over. It was very rude. My apologies. There are, however, to carry on Lee's question, there are some kind of cast iron examples that are out there in the marketplace of some very well-known big organizations that are traditional, that have moved to, agile-based, skills-based models. There is, without naming names, very large international, what's the best way of describing this organization? professional services and mainframe producing organization. They put in a skills-based model in their cloud services division. And that meant they ended up with project teams that were multidisciplinary, that worked around cloud technologies, data security, cybersecurity, and so on and so forth. And the result was increased innovation, faster development cycles, improved collaboration. So there's some really cast iron metrics that came out of the back end of that. I mean, everybody's heard about Google's skills-based project teams, right? That's common. It's out in the public domain. That led to the launch of Gmail and some of the other products as well in that area. There is a fast-moving consumer goods organization that implemented a talent marketplace without going through the full process of that. They unlocked hundreds and hundreds of hours of specialist skills, hundreds of thousands of hours, should I say, of specialist skills as a result of the talent marketplace that was there. So, there are, having said that it's kind of tough, there are cast iron examples of where it has worked around, using the kind of philosophy to make benefit for organizations.
One last question that came through from Cedric was, have we seen companies where they are trying to put value on skills? I think I would say more than half the companies we're working with are thinking about how do you put values on skills. I think it's probably the higher order of thinking as we look at it in terms of rewards and recognition linked directly to skills, because you've got to get the basics right of how are individuals identified, upskilled, resource management deployed. And so I do think that element of compensating or rewarding based on a given skill, I do think it will get there. I don't know how far out that is. I think intuitively, everyone starts to think, well, what would that be? And it really brings up the question of performance management and skills and what that begins to look like. So I think that's a higher order of thinking, and it will get there. But we haven't seen many organizations yet that have shifted that to that, because they've got a number of other more fundamental issues to address.
It's a good question from Cedric. And I have a slightly contrary view around this, where I've got an example from a client that, in a competitive marketplace, it was a pharma client in their oncology division. The feeling was in oncology amongst the leadership and the team was that you had to have loads and loads and loads and loads of experience of working in that particular area for you to be successful. What the challenge was in the organization was there was just a gravy train around the firms. You left from one, you got 20% rise, you left again, you got another 20% rise, and everybody knew it. And there was a real talent issue, and they were really challenged and struggling. So the contrary view is they adopted a skills-based approach. And what they found was this long-held belief that you needed to be so steeped in the technical area. If you understood the culture, if you understood the practices, you knew the ways of working, we can teach you the skills that might be needed and the knowledge around it. And they actually started transferring people in from outside to stop the kind of the value erosion they were getting and the attrition that was happening. So slightly different view, but it's kind of linked to the question that Cedric came up with.
Yeah, great question and great response. Well, I know we're at the top of the hour. Shivani, if you go to the next slide. If you want, as I said, we've done a survey globally where we've basically benchmarked 20 organizations, global organizations, and then plotted them against the dimensions that Craig talked about. If you would like to either have access to the research that was done and the report out, we're happy to do that. Just email us at businessimpact@niit.com. Or we can also send you the survey, email us at that same address. We can send you the link. Your organization can participate, and we'll actually plot you against the other organizations, and we would love to talk to you about what those opportunities might be. So businessimpact@niit.com to either get a copy of the report, or if you'd like to participate yourself, that would be great. All right. Well, if there's any questions that we didn't get to, we will try and respond to those offline. Sorry, we're out of time, but I do want to be respectful of everyone's time today. And thank you for your attendance. Good insight. And thank you, Craig and Jonathan, for your insight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Larry. Right. Thanks, everybody.
Have a great day. Take care.
Thanks.
Take care. Bye-bye.